Welcome to our 8th of 10 sessions in the Resilient Living series. Today we're talking about hope and optimism. The presentation portion of this meeting will be recorded and slides will be posted, so no need to take down notes. We will start this evening with a recap of some of our previous sessions, 7 sessions. And the first one that we discussed was emotional acknowledgement. So this is one of the cores of resilience. Emotional acknowledgement is being aware of your emotional state, being able to name and feel your true feelings without judgment or some of the more negative ways of coping with them, which can be stuffing, ignoring, or talking ourselves out of our emotions. So we discussed in this session how denying those emotions really goes in the opposite direction of effectively coping with life stressors. Emotional acknowledgement is also about remembering that when you're acknowledging your emotions, you are diffusing some of the energy behind them and taking some of the power away from them. And something that we focused on in every session, and that's important to remember when we talk about resilience, is that stress, and particularly the emotions we experience as a result of those stressors, is unavoidable. So we know there's nothing we can do to prevent those stressors from happening. We can be aware of our emotions and feel them without letting them drive the bus. And that's a good way for us to be able to process them without really letting them affect how we treat other people or change our actions. And then one other thing that we've explored in the 10 faucets is that many of these are connected and influence one another. So with the next faucet, self-calming, we see that it's very intertwined as a part of emotional expressiveness. And that being able to self-calm quickly helps us to truly acknowledge our emotions and process them more efficiently. And we'll definitely talk about that more with hope and optimism today, about some of the ways that it connects and functions in relation to other faucets that we can increase. So self-calming, this really goes hand in hand with emotional expression, as I mentioned, because it's hard to calm yourself down if you don't know what's causing the stress or the disturbance. So being aware of your stress response and actively working to recover in the moment is key. And then when you are stressed, your body's triggered into a fight, flight, or freeze response. And there's a physiological chain of events and consequences for our body when we enter that response. So it doesn't matter if it's a big or a little stressor, our body has the same biochemical reaction. And during these times, staying connected to your breath and to yourself is one of the quickest and most effective ways to help our nervous system regulate. So in this session, we talked about flipping the lid and how when we're stressed, our upper and our lower brain disconnect. And really our goal is to work to kind of close that gap and help them communicate clearly so that we're able to access some of our higher functioning skills that can be really valuable in the problem solving, the reasoning that we need to do sometimes to self-calm. So we also looked at mirror neurons and discussed why it's important for us to be able to model self-calming behaviors for those around us, because it helps them regulate their nervous systems when they can see others regulating theirs. And lastly, we just reiterated that important point that you can't prevent stressful things from happening, but you can bring yourself back from those stress reactions and do your best to really recover in the moment, which is what self-calming helps us be able to do, is end that stress response state as quickly as possible. Self-care was the third faucet we discussed. So this is an important way of being able to refill our cup or our gas tank, however you want to think about it. And we discussed in this session specifically physical self-care. So we spent the majority of the time talking about the 3 key aspects of physical care. So those are, having good sleep, good nutrition, and exercise or physical activity. Self-care and self-compassion go hand in hand, and we talked about how we must be able to come to an activity with the intention of sort of meeting our personal needs in that moment, and trying to make it not purely just about the physical aspect of it. And we talked about the more we can include self-care throughout our daily routine, the quicker and the more easily we're able to integrate this practice into our natural habit. And the more we're able to integrate it into our sort of natural rhythm, the faster our bodies are able to recover in dealing with stress. Hardiness. So this component is broken down into 3 different factors. The 3 C's of hardiness are commitment, control, and challenge. And commitment was really about, an individual giving their best in their circumstances. that involvement could include different areas of life. So giving your best at work, with your sort of family connections in your community or your religious community. It really is about being able to create importance in those different connections that we have in life and getting some sense of added purpose from those connections. So it motivates us to put in more effort in creating goodness and meaning in our life when we have this outside network. And then control. So this faucet was related to the fact that studies have shown that how much control we perceive we have in any stressor will influence how difficult that stressor will be for us to cope with. So we discussed the internal and external locus of control and why it's beneficial for us to have an internal locus of control or focus on the things that are within our control. And we're going to talk about sort of another aspect of control with optimism later today. But it's important to keep in mind that this, the locus of control is really about our actions. And then challenge. So the third facet of hardiness, this is that, we don't see every change or difficulty as a total threat, that we try to see it as an opportunity to learn or grow, and that we don't ruminate on those negative aspects of the challenge when we're experiencing it, but that we acknowledge it and we try to move on from it as smoothly as possible. And then self-replenishment. So this faucet is sort of another connection to the self-care that we discussed earlier in the year. And this is really about maintaining our inner reserves and learning to recognize when we're becoming depleted, and then using our skills to fill ourselves back up before we empty the bank. So this was more of the emotional withdrawals that we have. Self-care focused a little bit more on some of the physical things that we can do to replenish our tank, and self-replenishment is really about more of the emotional stores that we have. So when we are replenished, we know that we have a positive outlook on life, we have renewed energy, we're stronger and more optimistic than when we're depleted. And we know that self-replenishment can be a part of our larger self-care plan. So again, similar to self-care, it's something that should always be done from a self-compassion, a place of self-compassion. So, recognizing maybe what it is we truly need in the moment, as opposed to what society or what, your personal trainer says you should be doing in the moment, but really looking at it from a compassionate point of what will fill you back up. So we talked about how positive interactions are an easy way of sort of jumpstarting this replenishment, especially when we're in negative situations. And some of the things we can try to do to increase that are, being courteous to others, sharing praise with others, or physical gestures like a smile or a hug. And then just thinking about, when you receive recognition, how does that make you feel? And what are some of the things you can do to reciprocate that for others? So the invisible bucket, using the ladle and realizing that every interaction we have is either, adding to someone's cup or someone's bucket, or taking away from someone's bucket. It's really rooted in creating positive interactions in that way. And the renewable energy figure here in the corner, I like that as a metaphor, just because I think that self-replenishment, similar to renewable energy, it's something that we all have access to, and we just have to find a way to harness it to make it something that really is fueling for us. So it's about taking, some of the opportunities you have in your life and just being able to create moments of replenishment out of those. And then last month, we talked about non-judgment and self-supporting thoughts. So this is really, a few key components of this are the inner critic and perfectionism. So perfectionism is when you set unachievably high or unrealistic standards for yourselves or others. And then it's kind of about getting stuck in a sense of judgment or blame when those standards aren't met. So perfectionism is very connected to being aware of your inner critic and some of those judgmental thoughts. And we talked about how, to have control over that, you sort of have to be able to create some distance and see that your inner critic as a separate voice from yourself. And then from there, it's really about listening to what that voice is saying and actively working to fight against some of the less productive thoughts that we have. So non-judgment and self-supporting thought is very closely tied to hope and optimism, because you know, optimism is really being able to create those positive thoughts to kind of counteract our inner critic. And it's not, optimism, we're going to talk about this in a minute, isn't all about, you know, seeing everything through rose-colored glasses, but it's just really about being able to focus and create some productivity. And that's really also what our self-supporting thought, what our inner critic, the end goal of our inner critic is to have productive thoughts from that. So we're going to start with hope. So hope is, we're going to talk about in a minute, referred to as the backbone of optimism, but it's really something that I think is kind of vaguely used in society, but has a very specific definition in the resilience framework. So the definition that we are going to be working from is broken down into 3 different components. It is willpower, way power, and follow through. So willpower is our ability to set goals. It is seeing a greater approach or a different future goal in life and creating the sort of path to reach that. Way power is the ability to develop smaller action steps or pathways to reach our goals. So we know that our goals aren't typically easy. Sometimes they can be a little more challenging. And in those situations, it's helpful to have a plan to be able to reach them. So it's really about finding the different ways to achieve those and outlining them so that you have a accessible path. And then lastly, follow through. So I think especially for the FOP community and for the world in general right now during these times, follow through is really a critical component. And this is the ability to stay flexible, especially when things don't go as planned, so that we can work to still achieve our goals, just sometimes maybe through a different path or a different action step than we had envisioned. So this is really about, you know, working past the barriers that we have. So a few things about hope that I think also add a little more sense to understanding this probably new definition that I've put in front of you is that hopeful people set goals and they come up with manageable steps to achieve them. And they're also highly flexible when it comes to achieving these goals. So hope is a very powerful indicator of everything from athletic performance to academic achievement and to our ability to cope with things like serious illness. So people with high hope are, as I said, more adaptable. They're able to tolerate greater pain. They have less burnout and just a higher sense of self-worth. So I think in these, you know, willpower, way power, follow through, they can be very vague or they can be a very concrete way to add definition to a more vague term. So we'll explore that more and in a sample strategy that I want to talk about. So for hope, the willpower, that goal, you know, we want to start by setting a goal and focusing in on one thing, and then identifying activities that need to occur in order for us to achieve that goal. So what are some of the action steps or the pathways that we could follow to be able to bring that end goal to fruition? And for different levels of goals, these may seem like, you know, if my goal was just to get more sleep, you know, maybe there's fewer action steps than a little bit more of a complex goal. But I think that this process can still be really helpful no matter how big or small a goal is. So breaking these activities, these pathways into attainable steps, and then doing some preparation to think through what are some of the possible barriers to those and how will I work to overcome those challenges or course correct those challenges when they arise. So this is an activity that, you know, for anyone who's looking to achieve something in this later half of the year, when we get to, you know, the end of December and everyone's working on New Year's resolutions, this can be a really helpful step to take. And I know there are also all kinds of planners out there now that have similar sort of maps like this to help people break down their goals. And so just remembering that, I think one of the key things about hope is that it is really an important part of our optimism. Hope isn't a standalone faucet. It's very connected to optimism. And so in order to be able to really have the optimistic thoughts that we're going to talk about in a minute, it's important to practice this hope as well. So what is the difference between hope and optimism? Optimists may have a goal, but without hope, they may not have the plan or the motivation to reach their goals. So it's not enough to just believe that something will happen. We must also be able to see how things can improve and take action steps to make a difference when inevitably things may get a little more trying. So hope is a critical partner to optimism for this reason. So if you don't have a plan designed to ensure a desired outcome, it just makes it that much more difficult to reach it. So what is optimism? Being optimistic does not mean that you're out of touch with reality. So as I said earlier, it's not about the rose-colored glasses or being happy or bubbly all the time. Optimism is about having positive expectations about the future and believing that the right time, the right effort and support can make problems more solvable. So similar to what we discussed with perfectionism in last month's talk on self-supporting thoughts, just as we think that focusing on all of our faults or our mistakes may help us learn to improve our actions in the future, something we know is not necessarily true. People also often believe the worst about a situation to avoid being surprised or disappointed. So I think pessimism is a preservation method for a lot of us, but it's not as protective as you think, and it can have some damaging consequences on your health and your relationships. So chronic pessimism is associated with depression and premature deaths. So a Mayo Clinic study actually found that pessimist people were 19% more likely to die prematurely than when compared to optimists. And then also pessimism also spreads like wildfire across a group of people. So if you have a negative outlook or you're always expecting the worst, your coworkers or your loved ones, your families will have a really hard time staying positive in that sort of environment. And then also people are just more likely to avoid you or not support you if you're always having a negative outlook. And next month, we're going to talk about social support and why social support is so important for us in maintaining our resilience, but also what some of the more detailed steps of having effective social support are. And this reciprocity of support is a big one. So, you know, the more negative you are, the less you're able to kind of provide that for others sometimes. But this quote in the mirror here, I really liked as an example of, you know, what optimism looks like in a more every day-to-day approach. So it's really thinking about how on your toughest days, an optimistic person will still be kind to others and will believe that better days will come. So it's about really looking past and looking into the hard times to see the good times that lay ahead. So as I mentioned, you know, this pessimism can be sort of a preservation tactic. There's a reason why optimism does not come easy to us, and it's that our brain is wired to notice what is unsafe, what is missing or going wrong. So we talked about fight, flight, or freeze and how that, you know, evolved in more primitive times. And similarly, pessimism, you know, noticing what's unsafe or what's going wrong as a protective mechanism also stems from those times. But in today's times, it can also often do more harm than good. So Dr. Rick Hansen, who's a resilience researcher, wrote in his book, Hardwiring Happiness, that the brain is like Velcro for the bad and like Teflon for the good. And he reminds us that we really have to learn to take in the positive experiences and work to weave them into the fabric of our brain. So it's something, you know, like all the other faucets that we all have the ability to do. It may not come naturally, but it's something we need to really dedicate our efforts to in order to just make it more of our everyday practice and reaction to things. So we're going to talk now about how, a little bit about how we can do that. So optimists, some of the characteristics to think of when you are, you know, trying to envision yourself as an optimistic person or what it might look like for you is positive expectations about the future. So this could be things like believing that things will ultimately work out well in the long run, believing that in spite of troubles, life is basically good. That's something we're going to talk about more next month or in December with sense of coherence. And then also seeing problems can improve over time with the right support and effort. So they may see problems as solvable. For example, an optimist may think that there's always a way to get a job done. This is, I think we're starting to see now a little bit of how hope integrates with optimism, that life can be improved through effort, so through those goals and planning, and that stress is interpreted as a challenge rather than a catastrophe. So to break this down a little bit more, looking at bad situations, it really requires us to be constructive in how we view events and how we can change and improve to prevent things from happening again. So how an optimist views stress, there's sort of these 7 different categories for being able to sort of assign our perspective to them. So an optimist sees specific as opposed to global causes. This is that from the thought that it's really hard to change a global cause, but it's easier for us to tackle some of the smaller, more specific issues. So, in this example, if someone made a mistake at work, instead of just saying, I'm a stupid idiot, something that I think really feels out of your control, you can assign it to a specific reason. In preparation, maybe having someone check a memo. And internal versus external causes. So this is different than what I mentioned, the locus of control that we discussed earlier in the year. Instead of focusing on things that we can control, this is really focusing on the cause of the event. So do you see the cause of the negative event as being something external or something internal? So a pessimist will view bad events as caused by a modifiable external influence, because that's something that we can change and improve and work on. Modifiable versus stable. So this is really looking about the components of a situation that can be easily changed. So focusing on, something that you can adjust is a little bit more of an effective problem-solving method than focusing on some of the set aspects of a situation that we can't change. And then evidence. So this is important for optimists because a lot of times a pessimistic person may just make a statement that is really hard to back up. Whereas if you are trying to look at things from a more optimistic perspective, you can kind of base your beliefs in fact and remove some of the negative interpretation that tends to come with the pessimistic statements. So, you'll try to collect maybe as many different sources of evidence, so to speak, to sort of explain the situation. And then alternatives. So this is really about considering that the solution could come from a number of different avenues, that there may not be just one right answer, but that there are different factors that could be influencing why something went wrong or what happened in the situation. And implications. So this is really about seeing challenges as things that can be overcome rather than a catastrophe. So we talked about this in Hardiness, when we looked at, the control not the control aspect, the commitment aspect of, if you are able to see things as a challenge to be overcome rather than a catastrophe, it helps us in our ability to cope and practice resilience in those situations. And usefulness. So this is connected to a little bit of the self-supporting, non-judgmental thoughts we discussed last week, thinking about that inner critic and how that inner critic voice is okay to have, but we really want those thoughts to be productive and more growth-focused. So usefulness is really about having something be helpful versus unhelpful. And one example of how this maybe can be brought to a realistic situation a little bit more is an example of a tightrope walker. So if that person is just thinking about how they might fall, that's probably not a useful thought for them to have to focus on that possibility. So it's really about using these different 7 criteria as a way to process some of our more negative experiences and help ourselves see growth opportunities out of them. So just a couple other quick pessimistic strategies for challenging pessimistic thought that I wanted to introduce quickly are, this one is a little bit more of a process. So pick the most notable challenge of your day, and then kind of working through that challenge and thinking, what were some of our reactions? It's really connected to that emotional expressiveness faucet of recognizing how it made you feel, being able to process it using other cues in our body besides just, what you may immediately remember about the challenge. So it's really about breaking it down and working through some of the facets of, was there a self-calming practice you could have used then to help you process or work through that challenge? And then sort of a very different approach to challenging pessimistic thoughts is to turn towards more of a practice of gratitude. So thinking of 3 good things that happened to you today. And this is a good activity to do with family at dinner time or right before you go to bed. And research shows that these simple exercises really increase our feelings of happiness and optimism. So what are some other ways that we can integrate gratitude practices into our routine? Just a quick note to say first that gratitude practices are a way to start rewiring our brain to be more positive. So this is something that we're going to learn, we're going to work on continuously throughout the day as much as possible. And a gratitude practice is the act of being thankful, the desire to seek out and acknowledge the good things in our life. It's about focusing on both noticing and showing appreciation for life's gifts. So these can include activities and prompts that remind us to be thankful, even when you're going through a challenging time. And so I already mentioned this first one about, that it's a skill, it takes practice and intention, but making it a part of your daily routine. Slowly as we do that, we'll notice a shift in your positive self-talk and your interactions with others. And it's one of the reasons why gratitude is sort of a multiplying skill to have. It just, the gifts or the benefits of it multiply and become immeasurable over time. So some examples of gratitude practices. There's these 30-day of gratitude challenges. You can Google, there's a lot of different versions of this, but I like ones that focus on different sort of categories or avenues of life every day, but having something like this that you can print off and just look at every day is a really good way to integrate it into your daily practice. Maybe this is something you look at in the morning. And so you're kind of creating that gratitude touch point there. Keeping a gratitude journal, getting a gratitude partner, so someone that you can connect with over phone or email, video chat or in person. Spending time in nature. So we talked about in self-calming how nature and focusing on our senses is a really good way to calm ourselves during stressful times. And it can also be a really good way for us to notice simple things to be grateful for. Writing a letter or note to someone who has supported you. So you'll see that some of these are more connected to the filling the bucket theory of how we can increase our own happiness or our own feelings of well-being by also increasing others. Expressing gratitudes at mealtime, so that's a good way to do it throughout the day. Sharing the rose and the thorn of the day. So I'm sure you've all heard of, picking your sort of highlight of the day and a challenge of the day and reflecting on both of those as a family or a group. And then things as simple as practicing good manners, a gratitude jar, doing family projects to help someone else, gratitude stones, and one that I really like because I think gratitude seems very easy to implement, but can be challenging if it's not something that we're used to expressing in a day-to-day way, is just start by talking to your plants or your pets. And that's sort of a no pressure situation. They're probably not going to say anything back, but just really thinking about, what are some of the ways that your plant or your pet has benefited your life, and what are you grateful for about them? So these practices of gratitude are a way of really helping to increase or shape our perception in a more positive way. And that's important because we know that our perception creates our reality. So perception influences how you interact with the world, and is influenced by our expectations, our beliefs, our assumptions, fears, disappointments, resentments, regrets. A lot of, I think this focuses on some of the more negative things, but usually the negative perceptions are the ones we want to change. Our experiences determine who we become and how our brains are wired. So, two people can experience the same thing at the same time, side by side, and have two very different interpretations of the event. And that is because of their perception or the lens that they look through. So a few practices for really grounding our perception in facts and in creating a more positive reality. One is to start with the stop technique. So we've discussed this in several other previous facets. This is really connected to the self-calming. It's about the S is stopping. So notice when your feelings are overwhelmed and stop. Take some deep breaths and use them as sort of a brake pedal for your mind and body. Observe. So look at the situation from a bird's eye view and picture yourself, sort of climbing in a tree to see the full picture of what's really happening. This can be really hard to do in the heat of a moment of a negative situation. And then P is for proceed. So after you've gained sort of a broader perspective on the situation and observed the emotions that are overwhelming you, sort of returning to be able to process and move forward from there. So that's one technique for turning some of our negative or our challenging realities into a more positively perceived outcome. The next step or another method you can use is avoid jumping to conclusions about people and their motives or intentions. So give people the benefit of the doubt and trust that they have the best intentions. Especially this one can be important when you're reading text or emails. There's a lot in our language that goes unsaid, and in text and emails it can be a little more difficult to decipher some of that. So especially in written messages, number 2 can be very helpful. And then number 3, so if you notice yourself getting defensive, start getting curious instead. So ask open-ended questions to better understand what is driving the other person's feedback or behavior. So some examples of these are, you could say, help me understand, or tell me more, walk me through this. This step is really looking back at the stop technique about kind of putting pause on some of the more defensive perceptions we may have in the moment and trying to get that bird's eye view. So trying to take in a little bit more of the perspective of the person you're dealing with in the moment. Number 4, so realizing that when disagreements or differences occur, it can be helpful to really look at the situation and ask yourself what matters. And using that answer to ground yourself and to redirect the conversation to your shared values. So I think everyone has things that they can disagree on, but it's really about sort of picking your battles or choosing, what maybe you want to focus your energy on in that conversation. And then number 5, so not getting attached to the stories you tell yourself about a given situation, but really leaving room for the facts. This was something that we looked at when we were examining the chart of how optimistic people tend to view situations, and really looking at the evidence that is there. Oftentimes our stories are exaggerated or biased versions of what's really happening. So this quote in the book over here, reality is always kinder than the stories we tell about it. This 5th principle is really just about trying not to get attached to to maybe some of the baggage that sometimes we bring to our perception of stories, of the things that have happened. So another part of creating a positive reality is taking some time to clear out some of the negative files from our brain and make space for more positive realities. So this might include clearing out some old memories, grudges, regrets that really can hold us back from more positive thinking about our future or about our current situation. So one way to do this, the first step is, really not listening to the voice in your head that repeats those negative thoughts. Ruminative thinking is shown to be really harmful for people, and this is one of the reasons why that it doesn't allow for as much of the opportunity to move forward. So revisiting session 7 content to work on challenging your inner critic would be a really good way to start this one. The second point, so asking yourself, does this thought keep me stuck or move me forward? And sort of thinking about what's been the default mode around this problem. So in other words, what behaviors or beliefs or thoughts do you normally have surrounding this problem? That can be a really good way for us to identify, what maybe is keeping us from from letting go of that and reaching a more positive reality. Focusing on the strengths that we have to face the problem and what you can control, even if it's just your attitude or how you treat others. And then forgiveness. So this doesn't mean you have to excuse or accept anyone's bad behavior. It's really sort of with emotional expression about breaking that hold that this person's behavior has on you. So with emotional expression, we talked about letting go of anger, acknowledging it and releasing it. And that's one way of breaking its hold. So to forgive, sometimes we have to go back and acknowledge some of the things that maybe are more difficult to see and forgive, but to really focus on doing that as a way of releasing that incident's hold or the negative space that it's taking up in your brain. So one example of how to do this that I wanted to go through is just a short, it's only like 1.5 minutes audio of the quick coherence technique. So this is something that, similar to the rest of the resilience framework, is encouraged to do really throughout the day. It's just a way to practice self-calming and to practice really a hopeful, optimistic outlook.
Quick coherence technique for adults. If you've thought about acquiring a tool to take charge of your reactions and respond with inner poise and calm in the moment, we suggest you try the quick coherence technique. It's designed to help you activate and circulate the thoughts and ideas, allowing you access to a state of It just takes practice. To do it, you want to shift your focus of attention to the area around the heart, right in the center of your chest. Imagine your breath is flowing in and out of your heart or chest area, breathing a little slower and deeper. Keep doing it until
Sorry, Danny, I just...
a natural rhythm. Now, make a sincere attempt to experience a regenerative...
As you couldn't hear it very well. Oh, it's better, but fading in and out. Okay, well, if you guys can't hear it, it'll be linked in the slides. I can go ahead and make sure you can access it then.
Care for someone or something. The quick coherence...
If I can get it to stop playing. So that was just one other strategy that I wanted to share with you guys, and I can link to it in the slides. That'll go out as well. But the end goal of hope or optimism, it's really about remembering that our outside events tend to be less important than what we say to ourselves or how we react when they happen, and that our perception is really what creates our reality. And it's not enough to just wish for something to happen. For these more positive outcomes to occur, we must also be able to define our goals and have a plan to achieve them. So that is the